Coming up in this episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we throw it all the way back to March 1990's issue of Trains Magazine. Have your tickets out of the envelope and your time machine ready. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice-weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B. PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who may, possibly, hopefully one day becomes a highly trained broadcast specialist. And I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And for the second time this week, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, to get started, I want to inform you about a little piece of news that's circulating right now. You've probably seen it on allthingstrains.com. There is the word out there that Jim Foote, who was the just previous CEO of CSX, has passed away. Now, we can't substantiate that. We've been trying to find any possible source to verify, but there have been reports on LinkedIn from people who are close to Mr. Foote. Please pray for his family and him as well. He did about 3 or 4 years as CEO following E. Hunter Harrison, and was actually profiled years ago in another issue of Trains Magazine, and depending on the outcome of the news, we will talk a little bit about his career in the next episode. But I want to get started today. Now, we are doing a throwback to March 1990 of Trains Magazine, and this came about because of a viewer suggestion. Rodney M., who is a good friend of mine and a listener of the All Aboard Podcast from the beginning, and he said, hey, you've got all these Trains magazines out here, and not just Trains, but Passenger Train Journal and otherwise. Why don't you go and look back at some of those other magazines, what was going on then, and how it relates to today? And the March 1990 issue was actually one of my favorite, and here it is for those of you on CP5 Cam, and it was one of my favorites because I was about 9-10 years old when it came out, and it had a lot of really interesting articles. First of all, about the American European Express, which we talked about in episode 37, so it's linked below. Please take a look at that if you haven't already, but also because it had an extensive article about Canadian Pacific's new route over Rogers Pass in British Columbia, as well as the story of President Eisenhower's funeral train. So, getting into a little bit of what they were discussing at the time, the first thing was editor J. David Ingles' news and commentary piece about the December 1989 agreement between the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, and you know the Santa Fe of Super Chief fame, and J.B. Hunt. Now, that partnership was for the Santa Fe to simply move J.B. Hunt's trailers on its lines, and this was very revolutionary for the time for a variety of reasons. First of all, remember when we talked about intermodal in years past, in a lot of cases, it was done on a relatively small scale. So if you've looked back, especially at some model trains that a lot of rail fans like to run that picture the 60s and into the early 1970s, you'll see trailers or a cut of trailers that are in small, portion along with general freight. So you'll see hoppers and gondolas and otherwise. Well, that's because at the time, while intermodal was seen as a great way to bring some traffic that was lost to trucks back to the rails, it wasn't viewed in the unit train context that we do today. It also wasn't viewed in the way of someone else going out and doing the sales for you as the railroad, and then you simply carrying the goods. Now, as we got into the early 1980s and we started to get a lot of COFC, container on flat car, you saw that arrangement where the shipping lines, such as Hanjin and otherwise, would actually work with the end user to determine who was going to ship on their large ocean-going vessels, and then they were going to contract with railroads like Santa Fe competitor Southern Pacific to move the boxes, the shipping containers, aboard trains for either all across the U.S. or a portion of that. So that's where you started to see that double stack revolution of the early 1980s that was so noteworthy. But this partnership between Santa Fe and J.B. Hunt was different because, of course, this was taking an older effort, TOFC, trailer on flat car, but it was now moving these trailers for the trucking company. And remember, the truckers had been the fierce competitors of the railroads for quite some time. So they were going to work together. The Santa Fe benefited because J.B. Hunt was going to do the end delivery and also bringing the trailers to them in the first place. So they would literally come to your dock and take the trailer, whether it was branded for J.B. Hunt or otherwise, drive it to an intermodal yard with the J.B. Hunt driver, put it on the train, and then be a group, of course, of J.B. Hunt trailers put on a train that was solely going to be for the movement of trailers and in some cases containers as well, and move that to the other end of the railroad for the Santa Fe. In that case, it was California, not just Los Angeles, but they did have a fairly extensive network in the Golden State that also took them up to the Bay Area. So that's what was so big about it. What was really interesting is, of course, it had its detractors, and one of them was a name that's pretty familiar to us, Tom Finkenbeiner, who was then with Norfolk Southern, and he was working intermodal there. He would later go on to lead Pacer Stack Train, which of course has continued to be a leader in double stacking, and he questioned the need for using trailers, which is something that we've heard a lot, especially as I have reviewed different ideas about transportation and movement of goods in the present day. Because, as I mentioned, double stack was the vogue, using those containers. But what has become very important since was then now, but is even more noteworthy, is that you're seeing the containers put on truck chassis and used in place of simple highway trailers. And oftentimes, if you're on the highway, you'll see this. It has the same profile, same size. It can be pretty much exactly what you get with a truck trailer where the chassis is permanently attached, but you have the benefit of less weight because now you don't have to take the truck chassis with you as you move the box over the railroad. So that's an interesting thing to think about, is the trade-off between, is it easier to work with a trucker like J.B. Hunt where you're doing this? Would you rather work with a shipping company that's going to provide a lot of that? Or what about the middlemen of freight forwarders who were also part of the process for a very long time? So who was going to be doing this? But in this situation, it became a 34-year partnership between the Santa Fe and J.B. Hunt. And of course, in 1990, I believe it was 1996, the Santa Fe ended up merging with the Burlington Northern to form BNSF. And just last year in November, BNSF and J.B. Hunt renewed the partnership and restored the name Quantum, which was originally used for this service when it was launched in 1989. And as part of that, J.B. Hunt acquired portions of BNSF Logistics, which was the brokerage business, to add to that. So we're seeing that continue. And since that time, we've seen other arrangements, recently with CPKC and otherwise, where railroads are partnering with trucking companies to get the job done. So it is pretty noteworthy that what was going on in March 1990 has continued and actually flourished in that situation. And for those of you on CP5 Cam, I'll just go ahead and throw this on briefly, where it shows that J.B. Hunt and BNSF are expanding the intermodal marketplace. That is a press release from both carriers that came out in November of 2023. In fact, almost 34 years to the day of the original partnership launch. Now, moving on a little bit here in the discussion of this magazine, the arrivals and departures section, which is one of my favorite parts of trains because it just has a few small blurbs, included a variety of things, including the creation of the Fox River Valley Railroad, which of course would go on to become part of Wisconsin Central. But here was a story about CSX and the United Transportation Union announcing the elimination of the second brakeman on former Chesapeake and Ohio lines. And so at that point, the majority of CSX, so this included a lot of the C&O, the B&O, the Louisville and Nashville, that meant that you were down to 3 men required on those trains, on a crew. And that was down from 4. The holdouts, though, were districts on the Seaboard Coastline and the Georgia Railroad. Now, why am I mentioning that? Well, first of all, you've probably heard recently the Transportation Secretary did put out a ruling which basically has restricted the ability to go down to one-man crews without a variety of approvals. Now, this is something that has not been going on in any large number. The Indiana Railroad, which is one of the carriers that is fighting the effort to prevent one-man crews, is one of the few carriers that's actually done it. But In the time since 1990 to today, railroads have gone from a 4 to 3-man crew down to a 2-man crew, which is standard on the Class 1 carriers. This is something that both the railroads and the carriers have been looking to maintain, although in the wake of positive train control, the carriers have said, hey, look, since we spent all this money that, of course, the government mandated because of a Railroad Safety Act following a 2008 crash in Chatsworth, California, where a passenger train rear-ended a freight train. And that was kind of interesting because the private railroads were actually doing a very good job of safety, and this is a discussion we will have later because positive train control remains a hot topic in the industry. But the private railroads have said, well, since we spent billions and billions on this technology and we're starting to reap actual operational benefits of it, we want the ability to at least have the conversation about one-man crews. Well, back in 1990, though, the 4-man crews were still on the Seaboard Coastline and Georgia Railroad districts, as I mentioned earlier. And the other significant thing about that is something that it's important to remember. Railroads even now have to negotiate with their unions on the basis of districts, many of which correspond to carriers that no longer exist and have not been around for a long time. So that means there will be portions on the former Louisville and Nashville lines of CSX that correspond to the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis, parts of the former Seaboard Coastline section that correspond to the Atlantic Coastline, and otherwise. So when you hear a lot about negotiation with railroads and rail crews in the media, just remember it's not simply one person or a couple of people from the union sitting down with a few people from the railroad and hammering out negotiations. That will take place to a certain extent, but it also means that both the unions and the carriers themselves are going to have to go and sell it across their networks, which by now are, of course, quite large. So whenever you hear about holdouts or otherwise, that is part of where this is coming from, because some employees will have different opinions than others based on where they are geographically and also based on the agreements they currently have in force. So that's what I thought was very, very interesting. Because it does tell us a lot about what we're seeing today. Now, the question is, will we see a future issue? And I'm hoping that you'll see it in the Railroad Journal here on All Things Trains. Nothing against trains. They're a great magazine. We love them, and I encourage you each month to read their magazine, but also to get a lot of information here at All Things Trains because, hey, that's who we are. Will there be a discussion about going to one-man crews and partial automation and otherwise? These are things that we can't ignore. And quite frankly, regardless of where you stand on the issue, it's never going to work if we simply just decide, oh, we want to ignore it and we hope it goes away and we're going to lean on the government to foreclose on it. We are going to have to look for ways to accept the fact that the technology does exist and will probably get implemented in some form. It's just a question of how will that technology develop and how will it interact with those of us who are managing the railroads, operating the railroads, and otherwise. And let's remember, this debate does not exactly go back all that far because before 1990, keep in mind there was a lot of discussion about having a fireman on trains because after diesel locomotives were introduced, the fireman suddenly became superfluous to some people because, of course, there was no reason to manage a fire when you had an internal combustion diesel locomotive where you had a variety of sensors and otherwise that operate within the engine managing how that goes on its own. But the firemen stayed on largely because of labor negotiations, which in some cases included state laws that mandated certain crew sizes. One of the interesting stories about this I always think back to is Eugene Garfield, who was a friend of mine and the founder of the original auto train, and he paid the Seaboard Coastline, one of the railroads here mentioned in March 1990 of trains, and the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac to operate the original auto train. And he told me, and I thought it was really interesting, that one man would be doing the work of operating the train while the others in the cab were sitting there and playing cards. And at the time, this included some 5-man crew territory. So that was in the 1970s and into the early 1980s. So again, I'm not taking sides here, but I think it's interesting to hear the different perspectives and what this reminds us. Now, moving on to the railroad news photo sections in pages 14 and 15, there is a very interesting story about 2 Chinese Mikados, 282 wheel arrangement steam locomotives that were delivered to the United States from the Tangshan Locomotive and Car Works in China. China, that's right. In 1990, you could still get new locomotives, new steam locomotives built standard gauge in the world, and they were built, I believe, into the early 2000s in China and utilized there as well. Well, you had two railroads that had come out and said, hey, we wanted to buy them. One, I believe, was the Boone Scenic Valley in Boone, Iowa. Another was the Valley Railroad. And there was a third whose name escapes. Oh, the Knox and Kane, excuse me. The Knox and Kane, which operated over the former Erie Kinzua Bridge in Pennsylvania. Now, the Knox and Kane in this case, and also the Valley Railroad, acquired these two. One was SY 1647M, and the other was SY 1658M, and those are builder's numbers. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, first of all, let's go over to SY 1658M, because the story of this is not all that extensive. There is a picture of it, a relatively recent picture. It is operating on the Valley Railroad in Connecticut, and that is a tourist railroad that is part of a railroad museum that is up near Old Saybrook, if I recall correctly. And it is a beautiful area to visit, a great area to ride. If you've got your girlfriend or your wife that's going with you, or your husband, and y'all are into rom-coms, you're not all that far from Mystic, Connecticut, the home of Mystic Pizza, and a lot of great rail fanning you can do on the Northeast Corridor, that portion of the New Haven Railroad's former shoreline. But that, you see, is SY 1658M, which has been made into Valley Railroad number 3025 and heavily Americanized. In fact, when you look at the locomotive, the only real way that you can tell it is Chinese is to look at the builder's plate, which has Chinese characters on it. It has become one of the stables of that railroad, and hundreds or thousands of people, I don't know about hundreds of thousands, but thousands of people have ridden behind it over the years. Now, the other one, SY 1647M, has a little bit of a longer story. Now, many of you are probably very well acquainted with this locomotive. In fact, I was personally, because I got to ride behind it, and here it is on CP5 Cam. That is NYS&W number 142. Now, when Walter Rich was the Chief Executive Officer and Chairman, as well as principal owner of the Delaware Otsego Corporation, which owned the NYS&W, he was big on operating excursion trains and attempted to do it at a profit. Now, how much of it was profitable, I'm not entirely sure. As I looked through some of the old financial filings, it showed that in a variety of years, it could be good, it could be bad, it was very much up and down, but it was a business he was devoted to. And let's also remember that even if he wouldn't necessarily trumpet it, Walter Rich was very much a lover of trains, not just somebody who was in it to make a few dollars, which he did make a few dollars, more than a few, in fact. And the NYS&W provided excursion service at a variety of locations around its network, which included northern New Jersey, so stretching from the Secaucus area by Croxton Yard, going through Little Ferry on out to Sparta, and then into southern or southeastern New York State at Campbell Hall, after operating over Conrail in the former Lehigh and Hudson River, and then between Binghamton, New York, and Syracuse and Utica, as they had purchased and or gained operating rights on a portion of that former Erie Lackawanna, originally Delaware Lackawanna and Western branch line. Now, the 142 was a fan favorite, and I remember riding behind her in the early 1990s on an excursion out of Franklin Lakes, New Jersey, and the NYS&W had an extensive fleet of passenger cars, some of which were Pennsylvania congressional cars, others of which had come from the Long Island Railroad, and otherwise they even had what was called the Pope Mobile, which was a former Union Pacific dome observation that was converted into a theater car. And because of the way it was done, it actually kind of resembled the famous Pope Mobile. And that is what Walter Rich would use when he toured his railroad. They had a former auto train, full dome, and a variety of other equipment that was very interesting as part of their passenger operations. Eventually, they would buy a couple of E8s from or I should say E9AR is the technical term in this situation, from National Railway Equipment that had obtained them from the Burlington Northern commuter service out in Chicago, part of Metra, after they were retired in 1992. And of course, as somebody who loves E8s, I love that. But back to NYS&W number 142. So the 142 has an interesting story here. While it was delivered in 1989 and of course profiled in the March 1990 issue of Trains, it was not the first steam engine that the NYS&W had purchased for this purpose. They had actually purchased another one from the same Tangshan Locomotive Works, and something unfortunate happened. While it was on a trip on the way to the United States, it fell overboard and sank to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, where it still is today. And therefore, Walter Rich had to buy the 142 eventually to replace it. Now, as you can see, just as with the Valley Railroad locomotive, this one has been heavily Americanized. In some respects, it resembles a former Southern Railway locomotive that was used on the Morris County Central and is now back in the area. Actually, I should say the Morris County Central, which operated over the NYS&W during the period of the famous washout, or I should say infamous, at Smoke Rise, New Jersey. And you can see that in the way the headlight is placed and a lot of the other, the pilot and so forth on this. But it really does look like an American locomotive. And when I rode that excursion, I was trying to figure out what railroad did they get this from? And then I looked at the builder's plate and said, yeah, that's right. They got it new from China. So it was neat to see there. And obviously profiled here in the railroad news photos. Now, where is the 142 today? Well, it is owned by the New York, Susquehanna, and Western Technical and Historical Society, and you can occasionally ride behind it on the Belvedere and Delaware Railroad. So the Belvedere and Delaware is part of the growing network. Chesapeake and Delaware works very closely with the Maryland and Delaware. And they do allow the NYS&W Technical and Historical Society and the Black River Railroad Historical Trust, which is a nonprofit that was set up to operate the excursion services of the Black River and Western, which is an ingenious idea if you think about it, because as we mentioned earlier, whereas the NYS&W was doing that on a for-profit basis and as a public company, their financials had to reflect the up and down nature of the excursion business, as well as the up and down nature of the freight short line business, or I should say regional business here. The Black River and Western put this in a historical trust. So this way they were able to, number one, attract outside volunteers to come in, which is something you weren't really going to get in a constructive way on a for-profit company. And think about that. When was the last time you saw somebody volunteering at a for-profit company? Even interns now have to be paid in many instances. So that is difficult, if not impossible to do. And we're thinking about things such as being a car host or otherwise. So they're able to bring that in, but also have a role in how things are provided and make sure that it comports with their operations and is handled in a way that works for them and follows safety rules and so on. So it's not fully the model of someone else shows up with an engine and cars and says, hey, can we run excursions on your railroad? This is a partnership, but a nonprofit partnership, and the NYS&W 142 is a part of that. And this came about in the time after the NYS&W was privatized. So it went private in the late 1990s, around 1999, the same time that Conrail was taken over, because you have to remember the NYS&W was doing a lot of its successful business, including COFC traffic, container on flat car, that's double stacked trains for Marsk in partnership with CSX and Norfolk Southern as a way to compete with Conrail. But when CSX and Norfolk Southern purchase Conrail, the NYS&W is going to be odd man out, because while they certainly could have gone to the Surface Transportation Board and gotten agreements to allow trains to continue operating over former Conrail territory, which I think would have been reasonable given Walter Rich's place in politics and public policy, as well as being a well-known railroad entrepreneur, it probably was going to be about as viable as the Delaware and Hudson was in the 1970s when they did something similar after Conrail was created, which meant limited ability to serve any online customers. Most of what you were going to have to do was going to be at endpoints, and therefore, rather than deal with something like that could have potentially capsized the NYS&W, as the D&H eventually was itself, Walter Rich worked with CSX and Norfolk Southern. They provided capital for him to buy the railroad out from public shareholders, which included me. I had one share that my aunt had gifted me one Christmas, and actually, technically, I still have it, or I have a cash payment waiting for me somewhere. I didn't want to give it up. I'm that kind of guy. But they helped him buy it out. After that happened, the excursions declined, and then after he passed away, the new management ended that program completely, sold off the equipment. Now, most of it ended up finding more or less good homes. Some of it is on the Black River Historic Trust, where you can still ride on some of it, including some bi-level cars from the Chicago area that had come there eventually as well. But that does tell you a little bit of the story of rail excursions in New Jersey and how a lot of what was growing in the 1980s and even early 1990s has come to a quite a bit different status today. Now, moving on to page 15, they talk a little bit about and show a picture of the Winona Bridge burning down. That on its own is not really significant. This is in Winona, Minnesota, but the Winona Bridge itself was significant because it was part of the Winona Bridge Railway. And the Winona Bridge Railway, which was a short railway that we discussed in episode 25, the Regional Railroad Movement Part 2, was what the Burlington Northern, during the time that E. Hunter Harrison was part of that, and I mention him because he is so well known for trying some avant-garde things, especially precision scheduled railroading. And this was an effort to change the way that crew districts were set up and crew sizes to operate intermodal trains over parts of the former Burlington Northern. This, of course, did not work, and it ended up creating a firestorm of controversy among labor, but the Winona Bridge was a critical part of that. So while the bridge burning down wasn't all that noteworthy and the rail BN, as well as the Green Bay and Western, was able to route around that, its place in history will remain, especially as labor discussions continue to be something that railroads engage in on a large scale. Also on page 15, though, a little bit just as interesting and a little bit longer lasting, is NY Waterway. Now, this is what the ferry operation from the Hoboken Terminal, New Jersey Transit's Hoboken Terminal, formerly Erie Lackawanna and originally Delaware Lackawanna and Western, that's what the ferry services have morphed into. But this showed the reestablishment of that ferry service for the first time since 1967, when it had been discontinued by the Erie Lackawanna. Now, for a little historical perspective, for many years, as you know, a lot of railroads, so you have the Erie Lackawanna, the West Shore, which itself became part of the New York Central, the Lehigh Valley, the Pennsylvania itself, the Jersey Central, all of them came to the West Shore, which is northern New Jersey, the Hoboken, Jersey City, Weehawken area, where they would have ferries and lighters and barges in order to get people and freight across to New York City. Now, the Pennsylvania, of course, would eventually build Penn Station in New York, and just please go and check out our vlogs on the hashtag on the train series, because we were just there a couple of days ago and have some interesting stories to tell, and good places to eat, by the way. But they would eventually build Penn Station, which enabled them to take passengers into New York City itself from points south and west, and then, of course, transfer a lot of those passengers to the New Haven and take them to points north and east of New York City. But they were the only ones who ended up crossing the river that way. In fact, after that crossing underwater, you wouldn't have another crossing of the Hudson River until you got to the infamous Poughkeepsie Bridge of the New Haven, the Central New England Railroad, at Poughkeepsie, and then the next one being in Albany, where they're in the Albany area, where there are actually two, and I believe, three bridges of New York Central and affiliated railroads that cross the Hudson River there. So that has always been a barrier to rail transportation. Now, in the Erie Lackawanna discontinued ferry services, this was as part of its effort to limit the losses on commuter rail services in northern New Jersey. Now, as time went on, the state, which was always very adversarial, especially with its tax policies, and always trying to keep trains going, even when people had deserted them for automobiles, although in succeeding years, many of them would come back to the trains in some form, largely due to traffic congestion. the ferry services were also a very expensive money-losing item for the railroad. At one time, of course, they made sense when volumes were higher, but when volumes went down, you had old vessels that were constantly under threat of being condemned by the Coast Guard because they couldn't be maintained since the railroad didn't have money to put into them. So eventually the EL was able to get those ferries to leave, although it continued to have a marine operation crossing the river with tugboats, and they would take freight cars from Hoboken across to New York City. Now, there is a small ferry operation that still does remain, and that comes out of Greenville Yard, where New York, New Jersey Rail, which has undergone a variety of different name changes and is now owned by the Port Authority, does operate out of Greenville Yard, which is a former Pennsylvania railroad facility. But it does show you that there was very much an extensive marine network there. And I do have a small story. When I was working at Go Rail, I went for a meeting with an environmental group in Hackensack, and I won't say which one because, you know, I don't like to share anything where, you know, somebody might go back and say, well, hey, that was just us talking. But the interesting thing is this individual that I met with, his father and his grandfather had actually been employed by the Erie Lackawanna on the marine side. And one of the things that really hurt him was the fact that he had hoped to follow them into that. And of course, by the time he came along, the services had gone away. Conrail had gotten away from that as quickly as they could. And while to a lot of us, especially rail enthusiasts, it looks like a very mean thing to do, the sad part or part we have to keep in mind is that a lot of the freight that would once move in freight cars, and particular in box cars, is now moving in containers and in trailers, as we were talking about at the top of the show here. So a lot of that freight is still moving, it's just moving in a different way. And so therefore, the tugboats, the barges, the lighters, you name it, they all became superfluous. And that's why very little of this activity is there. But I thought it was very, very interesting and showed how deep that railroading really does run in our community, when somebody who, I had no idea when I was walking in, actually had not only been, it was a descendant of a family had worked for my favorite railroad, the Erie Lackawanna, and its predecessor, the Erie, but that he had expected to follow their footsteps into that as well. So it does show you how deep that railroading does run in our society, even if the vast majority of us don't really pay attention to it in the same way that our ancestors did. Now, one other interesting thing about what is now New York Waterway, the service, is they are operating ferry service out of the Hoboken Terminal to Battery Park City, Wall Street, and Midtown Manhattan. So a dense network there. But they also operate services further upriver to Newburgh and Haverstraw. Now, they're not operated out of Hoboken, but they're further upriver. And now, why is that significant to us? Because Newburgh and Haverstraw were 2 points on the Erie that once had passenger service. Haverstraw on the New Jersey, New York, which is where I grew up in Hackensack, New Jersey, and Newburgh, which actually had 2 lines on the Erie, as well as the West Shore, which is now CSX's river subdivision and where it still does go, and actually does operate a portion of the former Erie there. So it's nice to see, although rail transportation isn't serving there, you do have a burgeoning ferry service that's growing, and that does show how this continues to be a critical area overall. Now, 2 big parts of this magazine that were features, and I wanted to point out before we head out here. First is the death of David P. Morgan. Now, David P. Morgan, and we're going to get him on the CP5 cam for you here. There he is in the cab of Southern number 4501, which you can still ride behind at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum if you go down to Chattanooga. David P. Morgan was, I can't say enough about him, truly a guiding light of the industry. And I think more than anyone else, it was him that is responsible for so much of what we have in the railroad media today. It doesn't matter what magazine you write for. It doesn't matter what publication might be your favorite. It doesn't matter what book you love. His fingerprints are in there in some way, because not only did he inspire several generations of rail enthusiasts, writers, and otherwise, but he was so interesting in the way that he did it. You see, David P. Morgan wasn't just a guy who loved trains. He wasn't just a reporter who got a job in the industry who happened to like trains and then was able to become an associate editor, as he did in 1948 at $37.50. I think it was per week, or maybe even per month at that point. I have to recheck that. But what's more, he also started out at Trains, which was then a passion project for Al Kalmbach, A.C. Kalmbach, who founded the Kalmbach Publishing Company. And I want you to think about that too. When you're at a point where you're covering something that is, while very important in our culture, was not exactly mass market in the way that something like a Time magazine or a Life or a Saturday Evening Post was, but you have the wherewithal to say, we're going to create this as a passion project, and hired somebody to be associate editor for it. And then in 1953 became the full editor and worked at Kalmbach for 39 total years. It was interesting that he did that, but he was able to make it, as J. David Ingalls says in his article on the death of Morgan, as a combination of a hobbyist and trade publication. And so he walked that fine line, which is the same line that we walk here at the All Aboard podcast, because if you notice, railroading has such a diverse group of constituents that not everybody is going to be interested in the intricacies of the SD40-2, but not everybody is going to be interested in the intricacies of crew and labor agreements, but everybody has a stake in it. And so being able to convey that information in a way where everybody can get their piece and then understand the broader context. David P. Morgan was great at that. And what I did personally, and I love this because David P. Morgan is the person who really taught me how to become a good writer. He helped teach me to become a good speaker, even if it may not always seem like I am here. He is the person who taught me to become a voracious reader. And I am not the only one for whom he did that. And his writing style was much more professorial, or like someone who wanted to channel Shakespeare rather than somebody who was writing for hobbyists or a trade publication. So you see Morgan anywhere, everywhere, anytime you pick up a book about trains. And so his death was very sad, and it was a big, big loss for not just the Trains magazine community, but the industry overall. Now, he had not been, by that point, editor for several years. J. David Ingalls, who was his protege and has sadly now also passed on, took over and did a very good job in continuing the magazine. In fact, he was the editor by the time 1990, when this issue, the March 1990, came out. Now, there was one thing that I thought was very interesting, and I wanted to do this partly because, you know, it to a certain extent kind of, I won't say made me cry, but I think the phrase that we like to use is, I had smoke in my eyes. There was a poem written for him by Nancy Westerfield, and it was entitled, For David Who Went by Train. David, because you went there by train, ahead of us we spent one night of our honeymoon in Altoona, climbing a cemetery hillside to look down by moonlight on a graveyard of car shops. Because you took the train, David, we traveled the Mountain Division, standing to view the K4 at Horseshoe. How could the K2 in Caracamas compare? Because you went by train, David, we stood in the rain. At Crewe, stood in the rain at Two Harbors, stood in more rain at Roanoke, kissed by steam everywhere. For us, sick in the hospital, David, good cheer came as a propped open Trains magazine of abandoned branch line in Kentucky, so clear we could hear mockingbirds sing. Go by train now, David, on Damish End, silver rails over carved mahogany ties to wherever your next station calls. And when we follow by train, David, be there. And it just kind of shows the level of impact and how much that not only railroads themselves, but the people who wrote about them really did matter. Now, the final part I wanted to cover was Ike's Trains Part 2. Now, there were a few episodes where they covered trains related to President Eisenhower, but Bob Withers, William Howes Jr., and David A. Watts Jr., all of whom were legends on their own right in the industry. David Watts being Vice President and General Manager of Amtrak, William F. Howes Jr., having a variety of positions with the Chesapeake and Ohio and Baltimore and Ohio. And Bob Withers, who is a noted railroad author, put together a very, very long article about President Eisenhower's funeral train. And so they talked about the entire story and even got to nuances such as how much it cost, what they were billed for, what the prospective schedule was, what the actual schedule was, and even down to something as small as Mamie Eisenhower, President Eisenhower's widow, being tired of eating very delectable food in the Santa Fe's private car and just wanting some small cold sandwiches, and the C&O B&O crew deciding they will make it for her, even though they were certainly expecting the opposite. And the story here is, after the president died, President Eisenhower, there had been an effort to move his body back to its final resting place in Abilene, Kansas. Now, prior to this, Penn Central operated a funeral train for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. that was very well televised and well followed. Lots of people lined the Northeast Corridor or main line, Philadelphia to Washington, in order to see this train. Unfortunately, 2 people ended up losing their lives because while they were doing that, they managed to step onto active track. And so the article talks about how President Eisenhower's family didn't want anywhere near what they called a circus atmosphere to break out for that. So almost as much as possible from the planning or otherwise of this was kept secret. And it involved the Chesapeake and Ohio, Baltimore and Ohio, Norfolk and Western, and Union Pacific in order to get the train between Washington, D.C. and Abilene, Kansas. So you have the full explanation of what's there. You have a breakdown of the equipment that was remaining by the time of 1990, in March 1990 when the article came out. You have a lot of personal anecdotes. You have behind the scenes photos and otherwise. And so you really do see what it took in order to operate this. And what struck me the most was the cost was about $76,000, although that's not out of line when you consider that you had to get several railroads together, and not just the train itself, but also pilot trains to make sure there were no problems along the line as the special moved through. It made me think about a few things. First of all, you can see the car that President Eisenhower traveled in at the Baltimore and Ohio Rail Museum, and we'll get you Railroad Museum. We'll get you a picture here. There's car 314 of the Chesapeake and Ohio. That was the 3rd car that was selected after the first 2, for a variety of reasons, Railroad decided they should not use those. But here you go. You have C&O 314. And for many years, it actually reposed with what you see there, which is AFT1, former Reading T1 484-2101. Now, last fall, the 2101 was actually moved into the restoration shops, where it will be resplendent once again in beautiful American Freedom Train paint. But it is notable to see that. And the discussion of President Eisenhower's funeral train made me think a little bit about the most recent presidential funeral train, which we saw a few years ago, and that is here, and George H.W. Bush, when he passed away, and this was in December of 2018. Just like President Eisenhower, George H.W. Bush's body moved in a baggage car, and it was certainly adorned well in both cases for them to be respectfully treated. And in both cases, they were followed extensively by the public, not only on TV, but in person, paying tribute to the fallen chief executives of our nation. The other interesting thing, of course, as many of you know about President Bush's passing, is that the locomotive which led the train, SD-70 ACE number 4141, had been painted for President Bush in 2005, and it is going to be displayed with the expected date sometime in 2024 at his presidential library, permanent display in College Station, Texas. So look out for that, and certainly when that does happen, we will make sure to have information on that event for you so that you can attend, and hopefully we'll be able to cover it as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this excursion into the past, and also how a lot of the things that were going on in the past really have influenced some of railroading today. So we will be back with you, I believe, on Monday, as we are pushing back the first movie review of Murder on the Orient Express, quite frankly, because I need more time to watch the movie. So thank you for tuning into the All Aboard podcast. We will see you down the main line, and I hope you have a great day.